banks will settle in Bitcoin, oil trade will be settled in Bitcoin. Do you see that as something that could happen?
Well, I think the longer it goes, the less outlandish that sort of scenario gets. I mean, if you were to call that when Bitcoin is 500, it looks sillier than when you call it when Bitcoin's at 50,000, for example. As roughly $1 trillion asset, it's becoming meaningful on the macro scale. I think if Bitcoin continues to get adoption and continues to grow in market capitalization and liquidity, it becomes increasingly useful as a reserve asset. And people often think that a reserve currency has to be binary. Like you either have the reserve currency, you don't. Whereas in reality, it's somewhat of a spectrum. So the United States has quote unquote the reserve currency. It's very dominant. But the euro and the yuan are also these contenders where they're not really in a position to just replace the dollar and become the new kind of just by far dominant global currency. But really what they're aiming for is to be regional reserve currencies. They want to be able to trade with enough of their partners for key things they need in their currency. And so I think you certainly could see, for example, maybe some small African countries become yuanized, if that's a word. But it's not something I'd have. Yeah.
I think we just invented it.
I think we invented it. Maybe, yuan is a word. So.
And Bitcoinized is a word.
Bitcoinized is a word.
Yeah, we can do it. I can't really say it. Yuanized. Yeah. I think what's really interesting looking over the next decade is whether we see the consolidation of currencies. We have dollarized nations, but that really is a decision on the country itself, whether it wants to go into a dollar standard. And again, I'm way out of my field of knowledge, but how a country does that. But in this world where we now have Bitcoin and digital currencies, one of the conversations or one of the things I put on the table with Nick Carter is in a country like Turkey, where the currency has collapsed and people have talked about, Bitcoin is a great lifeboat for people there, but really, yes, to an extent, but also it's volatile, so it's not really useful day to day. And actually, for a lot of people there, maybe the tether or any form of stable coin, is a better currency to have. And you could possibly see this kind of black market or bottom-up dollarization of a nation just through the local people saying, we're not having this anymore. Like if I was in Turkey, I would be converting my lira to both Bitcoin and digital dollar right now rather than holding a collapsing currency.
Yeah, no, I think so. Basically, yeah. It also, there's cultural elements. So, I mean, there's multiple local options too. They can buy gold as long as they're not blocked from doing so. It's easier to do that with gold than with something like Bitcoin or even stable coins. And also real estate, but again, that can be a liquid and, it's not accessible for everyone. And so I do think that things like Bitcoin and dollar stable coins are another avenue for them. And so depending on someone's needs, there's all these different options. In the long run, of course, stable coins are not an ideal option because you're losing purchasing power over time, right? So you're not really getting paid interest, and yet the dollar is becoming worth less in terms of real assets most year after year after year after year, sometimes at a higher rate like you've seen in 2021. And so it's not necessarily something you want to store the bulk of your wealth in, but sure, absolutely when your own currency is falling rapidly, the fact that the dollar is inflating at like 6% is way better. Well, I mean, official CPI, right? So when they can jump onto the dollar and hold that until they figure out what they want to do and they want to put in other assets and they just want to hold that for like 6-12 months, it makes perfect sense. So as percentage of what they're doing, it absolutely makes sense for them to get into stable coins in many cases.
But do you see that scenario of currencies consolidating around the world?
I think we've been seeing it for a while.
Okay.
And I do think that's probably a trend that's going to continue.
Okay. So the role of Bitcoin in all of this is that it's obviously banned in China, and it feels like it's an opportunity for the US. I was talking to Austin Hill about this beforehand, but by the US being open to Bitcoin, they're actually open to the people of the US being able to hold something that appreciates in value, which could raise up the wealth and the strength of the US itself. And I know the regulators have to walk a careful tightrope of protecting the dollar, also wanting to have mass surveillance, but it feels like it would be a smart geopolitical move for the US to be quite friendly towards Bitcoin.
I think it's a lot of people take for granted that the current system benefits the US. And as we discussed, in many cases it does. It basically extends our hegemonic reach, but at the cost of our own domestic vibrancy, right? So there's a knee-jerk reaction for politicians, I think, to defend the dollar system when if they go down the rabbit hole, they realize that for maybe 90% of Americans, the dollar system is not really working for them anymore. So there's that. And then two, even alongside that system, as you pointed out, there are a lot of benefits from being the center of Bitcoin, basically having a lot of the hash rate and a lot of the holdings of Bitcoin among your private companies and private individuals. And so I do think it makes sense that you want to keep that culture of inviting invitation, being the hub that companies can come and develop on, so you get all the tax revenue and all the employment from the jobs around the space, as well as the wealth that can come if that ends up being the correct move. If Bitcoin goes up 5 or 10-fold in market capitalization and the Americans hold a very large chunk of it, that obviously benefits the United States. And so from regulators' perspective, they don't like the fact that you can do permissionless payments. They want to be able to surveil and block transactions that they don't want. Maybe not quite to the extent of China, but most countries around the world want some degree of that. That is usually more so than what most private citizens would think is acceptable to say what they can or cannot do with their own money. And so I think they are walking that tightrope. But I do think, if I was a political leader, I would absolutely embrace Bitcoin because
Bitcoin.
Yeah. Bitcoin. Misspoke.
Bitcoin is the UK CBDC.
Yeah. We'll see how far they get with that, but.
Yeah, I've got a comment on that. I'll come back to that. Well, I'll say it now. One of the things I worry about the CBDCs is that we benefit from a fractured financial system in that if one part breaks, you can use the other part. If my Visa goes down, you can use your MasterCard, or you can use Amex, or you can use cash, or you can use Bitcoin. But a system that trends toward one centralized CBDC, I don't feel like it puts the whole economy at risk.
Absolutely, because the whole economy can shut down if that stops working. And we've seen, for example, FedWire can go down. It's not unheard of. And so these central systems can go down, and it can impact everything. We've seen, for example, just in recent days, Amazon Web Services had an issue, and countless businesses that you'd have no idea that they go down. You don't realize that they're running on Amazon Web Services. Imagine if they had 100% market share, right? And so it's the same thing with currencies. And that's why, most people that travel a lot, it's nice to have, physical currency with you, just in case, you never know when just your car is not going to work for some reason. You never want to be without payment. And if you're 100% reliant on centralized, internet-based technology, that's an inherent vulnerability.
Do you think we'll get to the point with Bitcoin where the long-term vision that some people have had that banks will settle in Bitcoin, oil trade will be settled in Bitcoin? Do you see that as something that could happen?
Well, I think the longer it goes, the less outlandish that sort of scenario gets. If you were to call that when Bitcoin is 500, it looks sillier than when you call it when Bitcoin's at 50,000, for example. As roughly $1 trillion asset, it's becoming meaningful on the macro scale. I think if Bitcoin continues to get adoption and continues to grow in market capitalization and liquidity, it becomes increasingly useful as a reserve asset, right? So you start with the fringe countries, the ones that are either kicked out of the dollar-based system or they're already dollarized and they want to, like El Salvador, for example, they want to do this move to attract all the tourists, they attract the capital, lower remittance costs, a bunch of reasons, even just, put their name on the global stage in a way that it wasn't a year ago. So there's those incentives. But basically, the bigger it gets, the more useful Bitcoin becomes as a reserve asset. It becomes another way for Russia, for example, to make themselves more sanction resistant. And again, you might not always agree with the countries that might use it, but if you understand their own incentives, you can see why they might become interested in that technology. And so I do think that the bigger it grows, essentially this uncensorable public ledger that's quite secure is attractive for individuals, companies, and nation states in many cases. And of course, it has to get big enough to attract those larger pools before they start taking it seriously.
Feels like there's an incentive for everyone to use it, but for different reasons.
Absolutely. Basically going literally from cypherpunks to, unsavory types of either countries or individuals, or just people in Turkey that want to protect their purchasing power, or people in the United States that want to protect their purchasing power. Basically, there's one of the common problems worldwide is how to store your value, how to store your wealth, right? Especially in this era where we're essentially in financial oppression. So interest rates are below the inflation rate, usually in terms of the official inflation rate, let alone whatever the quote unquote real inflation rate is. you're not really keeping up with the creation of currency. And so there's natural people are monetizing all sorts of things. They're monetizing art more than they used to. They're monetizing their homes. So you have home value to income ratios going up dramatically. You're monetizing stocks where you say, I don't even know what the stocks do. I just want to shove money into an index fund because it's better than cash. So we monetize all these other assets. And so the world pretty much has a store of value problem, and it becomes worse for emerging markets that don't have access to a lot of, you can't buy fine art, you can't, real estate is trickier, you can't buy the S&P 500. And so Bitcoin is one that they can all hold on their mobile phone. And then of course you have countries like Iran that say, okay, we want to be able to buy things if we want to, and there's this permissionless payment rail that we could use. So there's also pretty much any actor out there can use Bitcoin for a purpose.